Imagine, if you will, a chamber cloaked in suffocating darkness, heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the brittle English winter light. The air hangs thick with the sour stench of human decay, the rank aroma of rotting flesh mingling with the heavy, cloying sweetness of perfumes and herbs desperately scattered to mask the inevitable. The walls, once resplendent with tapestries, are now faded and stained, their colours dulled by time and neglect. The only sounds are the laboured, ragged breaths of a dying man and the soft, anxious shuffling of servants, terrified of both their master's wrath and his looming death. And at the centre of it all lies King Henry VIII, once a magnificent golden-haired prince, now a grotesque, bloated parody of his former glory. By the winter of 1547, the ageing Tudor monarch's body had swelled to monstrous proportions. His waist, once a trim 34 inches in his youth, had ballooned to nearly 60 inches. His frame carried an estimated 300 to 320 pounds of dead weight, made heavier by the deadening burden of disease. He was, quite literally, a man who was rotting alive. The chief affliction plaguing the king was a pair of ulcerated, suppurating wounds on his legs, the ghastly legacy of a catastrophic jousting accident in 1536. Nearly 11 years later, those wounds had never fully healed. The ulcers festered with infection, their edges blackened and ragged, exuding an unceasing flow of thick, yellow-green pus. One eyewitness remarked that the king's chambers were heavy with the fetid stench of his corrupting flesh, a smell so foul it was said to turn the stomach of even the most seasoned courtier. The ulcers, likely exacerbated by circulatory failure and perhaps diabetic complications, would crack open without warning, the skin splitting like overripe fruit, discharging foul-smelling matter onto the bandages, his bedding, and sometimes the very floor of the royal apartments. Physicians, powerless against the festering rot, applied poultices of rosewater, honey, vinegar, and herbs, none of which succeeded in halting the spread of infection. And it wasn't just his legs. The rest of Henry's body was in open rebellion against him. His flesh was mottled and discoloured, his face puffy and sallow, his once bright blue eyes, famous for their twinkling charm in his youth, had grown bloodshot and clouded. His teeth were blackened stubs. The king, whose appetite remained voracious even in decline, consumed prodigious amounts of meat, sweet wines, and rich puddings, contributing to his soaring weight and the toxic build-up of uric acid in his joints, likely causing painful bouts of gout. It's believed that Henry suffered multiple strokes in his final years, leaving him frequently confused, irritable, and prone to violent mood swings. Once renowned for his wit and musical gifts, he had become a tyrannical, paranoid figure, a prisoner within his own decaying frame, lashing out at anyone who displeased him. The king also developed what contemporary physicians described as melancholia, a profound depression compounded by insomnia. He would lie awake for nights on end, staring into the flickering candlelight, muttering to himself, or demanding endless recitations of scripture. The servants assigned to his night chamber reported hearing the king sobbing in the darkness, begging for God's mercy and the company of Jane Seymour, his long-dead third wife, the only woman he claimed to have truly loved. Despite centuries of lurid rumours, there's no credible evidence that Henry VIII was ever afflicted with syphilis. His sexual history, though colourful by modern standards, was relatively tame compared to other monarchs of his era. He had 6 wives, a few mistresses of note, and produced both legitimate and illegitimate offspring. Contemporary records and posthumous medical examinations found no indication of the syphilitic lesions, neurological symptoms, or degenerative facial deformities typical of advanced venereal disease. Instead, modern historians and medical experts attribute Henry's decline to a combination of obesity, type 2 diabetes, circulatory disease, and complications from his chronic leg wounds. The incessant systemic infection from his ulcers likely contributed to periodic sepsis and may have poisoned his blood, accelerating his mental and physical deterioration. But his horrors didn't end there. By the bleak, bitter days of late January 1547, the once mighty King Henry VIII was a ruin of a man. Spent, swollen, and sinking fast, he lay entombed within the heavy hangings of his vast, dimly lit chamber at Whitehall Palace. The room, once bustling with courtiers, musicians, and ambitious suitors, had grown eerily silent. No music played now, no poets recited flattering verses, no one dared disturb the suffocating quiet of the royal deathbed. The king had spent his final 8 days confined to his massive canopied bed, a structure said to be so large and sturdy it could hold 12 men, though now it cradled only one bloated monarch, his monstrous body barely capable of movement. He could no longer lift a goblet of wine to his cracked, blackened lips, nor raise a hand to sign a decree. Even the simple act of turning his head caused him visible agony. The air within the royal apartments was thick with the appalling stench of death in waiting. The foul odour of his infected leg ulcers, those gaping, pus-dripping wounds that had plagued him for over a decade, clung to the tapestries, seeped into the bed linens, and curled beneath the doors. Herbs, spices, and burning incense failed to disguise the sickly sweet aroma of decaying flesh. Servants tasked with tending to the royal body recoiled in horror as they changed the soiled dressings, each unwrapping revealing fresh eruptions of congealed pus and blackened necrotic tissue. No one dared show revulsion. To displease the king even now might mean ruin. And yet, for all his evident decay, no one spoke the words aloud. Under the rigid statutes of Tudor law, it was treasonous, punishable by death, to predict the monarch's demise. Physicians, though privately aware that death was imminent, were forbidden to utter so much as a hint of it. The court existed in a strange, macabre limbo, pretending that England's sovereign remained as vigorous and indomitable as in his youth, even as the reality of his rotting body told a very different story. The political stakes were enormous. The king's death would plunge the realm into uncertainty. His heir, the sickly 9-year-old Prince Edward, was too young to rule, and the factions circling the royal court waited like vultures for the inevitable power struggle. Every word, every gesture was weighed with care. At last, sensing the hour had come, a select few braved the king's fetid chamber to summon Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who had once presided over the king's marriages, divorces, and excommunications, and now would witness his final hours. Cranmer was led quietly through the shadowed corridors of Whitehall under cover of night, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by thick carpets and the oppressive hush of the royal apartments. When he entered the sick room, he was met with a scene both pitiful and grotesque. The great King Henry VIII lay pale and unmoving, his massive frame sunken into the blood-stained pillows, his face waxy, bloated, and unrecognizable from the handsome prince he had once been. His lips were cracked and dark, his breath shallow and rattling, each inhalation a dreadful gurgling effort. His eyes, when they opened at all, were glassy, unfocused, lost in fever and delirium. Cranmer approached the bed with solemn reverence. He knew, though none dared declare it, that the end was near. In those final moments, Henry could no longer speak. The powerful voice that had once thundered through courtrooms and battlefields had fallen silent. All that remained was a flicker of awareness, a faint glimmer in those fading blue eyes. Cranmer took the king's mottled, swollen hand, the flesh cool and clammy beneath his fingers. He leaned close, the scent of death overwhelming even the strongest perfumes in the room. In a hushed voice, he asked the dying monarch if he placed his soul in Christ's hands. The king could not answer. He could not move his lips. But he mustered a final feeble effort and gave the faintest squeeze of the archbishop's hand, a small trembling sign of faith, of submission, or perhaps of sheer mortal terror. It was the only response he could manage, but it was enough. As the pale dawn light began to seep through the chinks in the heavy curtains, the once mighty king's laboured breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell with ragged irregularity, each breath shallower than the last, until finally it stopped. The chamber held its breath. And then, quite suddenly, it was over. The King of England, Henry VIII, conqueror of men, destroyer of queens, founder of churches and tyrant of realms, was dead. At the age of 55, his life, marked by grandeur, cruelty, indulgence, and bloodshed, had come to a squalid, stinking end in a darkened room reeking of death. With that final fading heartbeat, an era had passed. But death, in Tudor England, was not a deliverance. For even in death, the body of a king was subjected to torment, ritualistic, invasive, and gruesome. The death of a sovereign was a state affair, and Henry VIII's bloated, decaying corpse would endure a macabre post-mortem ordeal before it could be laid to rest. Under custom, royal corpses could not simply be left to decay naturally. The body of a monarch had to be preserved, or at least disguised, long enough for the elaborate funerary processions, vigils, and interments befitting a sovereign of England, and so, within hours of his last breath, Henry's corpse was delivered into the hands of the royal surgeons and embalmers. In a chamber reeking of death and cloying resin, the king's body was stripped, revealing the ghastly ruin beneath his silken nightshirt. His limbs, swollen and discoloured, bore livid bruises and mottled patches of dead flesh. His stomach, distended by years of gluttony and illness, protruded grotesquely. And from the now stilled ulcers on his legs came a final oozing seep of blood-tinged, fetid pus. The embalming procedure was a brutal affair. According to period accounts, the body was first spurged and bowled, the abdomen was sliced open, and the entrails removed by hand. Surgeons plunged their hands into the king's distended belly, fishing out the bloated organs, already beginning to liquefy. The viscera were cleansed as best they could manage, though some claimed the putrefaction was so advanced it stained the surgeon's hands black. His entrails, considered sacred remnants of royal flesh, were placed reverently in a separate lead-lined casket and buried apart at Westminster Abbey. A curious but common practice in the age, ensuring every part of a monarch's body was accounted for. The now hollowed corpse was seared and embalmed in a desperate attempt to halt the tide of rot. Aromatic powders and pungent resins were forced into every cavity. Cloves, myrrh, balsam, frankincense, nigella, camphor, and other exotic spices, imported at vast expense from the far corners of Christendom. The embalmers stuffed the gaping abdominal cavity to bursting, hoping to arrest the creeping decay. The body was then slathered in unguents and resinous balms before being tightly bound in layer upon layer of waxed linen cerris cloth. A thick, tarry-scented burial shroud designed to keep the flesh intact and delay the inevitable putrefaction. It was a grisly, painstaking business, made worse by the size of the king's corpse. Henry's vast girth worked against the surgeons. No matter how much spice, no matter how many linen wrappings, the internal corruption could not be contained for long. When the grim work was done, the swaddled corpse was encased within a massive lead-lined coffin. This too was customary, intended to seal in odours and bodily fluids. But Henry's immense size made the coffin a tight claustrophobic prison. Its believed extra force was required to close the lid, the already decomposing flesh pressing against the metal shell. Then, as protocol dictated, the coffin was placed beneath a cloth of state, surrounded by burning tapers and watched over in solemn vigil while elaborate arrangements were made to transport the king's body to Windsor for burial alongside Jane Seymour, his one true wife. In theory, the potent mix of herbs, spices and wax should have preserved the royal corpse long enough for its final rites. But the reality was grim. the embalming could not halt the unstoppable corruption of flesh. Henry's enormous size, combined with the infected ulcers that had festered for over a decade, ensured that decomposition advanced with shocking speed. On 16th February 1547, nearly 3 weeks after Henry VIII's rancid corpse had been packed, embalmed and swaddled in cerris cloth, the royal funeral procession at last began its grim journey southward from Whitehall to Windsor Castle. The cortege was a sombre, lumbering affair. Dozens of mounted guards, torchbearers, nobles in black mourning cloaks, and a massive black-draped carriage hauling the king's leaden coffin, a veritable tomb on wheels. Inside that coffin, Henry's grotesque remains lay swollen and restless. The embalming spices, cloves, myrrh, balsam, and exotic nigella, struggled to mask the stench of a corpse already revolting against its bindings. The lead coffin, constructed hastily to accommodate the king's enormous rotting bulk, had already shown signs of strain. The sides bowed outward, and beads of fluid sweat appeared around the seams. The roads of Tudor England were rough, pitted, and treacherous. The heavy carriage creaked and jostled over every stone and rut, and with every bump, the pressure within the coffin mounted. Beneath the royal standards, the king's body was bloating, liquefying, a dark, monstrous secret being hauled toward eternity. That night, the cortege stopped to rest at the ruined Abbey of Sion, a half-deserted religious house northwest of London. It was here, amid the cold, decaying cloisters and wind-battered walls, that an eerie and sinister prophecy was destined to unfold. 15 years earlier, a defiant friar had stood before Henry VIII and denounced him, likening the king to Ahab, the wicked Old Testament monarch. The friar's words had been bold and damning. God's judgment will come. Dogs shall lick thy blood, as they did Ahab's. It was a dangerous prophecy in an age when the king's word was law. Yet now, within the desolate walls of Sion, those ancient words would fester into a grotesque reality. In the dead of night, as the mourners and guards dozed fitfully and the scent of resinous torches mingled with the perpetual stink of decay, an ominous sound was heard from within the great carriage, a dull, wet crack. The endless jostling and the grotesque pressure of putrefaction had proven too much. The seams of Henry's lead coffin split open. According to one account, the leaden coffin was being cleft by the shaking of the carriage. The ancient stone floor of Sion's lodging grew slick with a dark, foul-smelling fluid that seeped out from beneath the carriage and pooled in viscous, unholy puddles. By grey morning, the abbey stank of putrefaction. Dogs lick his blood. And then came the final horror. As dawn broke over the frost-bitten grounds of Sion, the ghastly tableau was discovered. A stray dog, or perhaps two, depending on the chronicler, had slunk into the chamber where the king's corrupted body lay. Drawn by the irresistible stench of rot and royal gore, the animal had begun lapping at the dark, putrid matter leaking from the broken coffin. Eyewitnesses recoiled in revulsion. The scene was an obscene parody of piety. The king, once England's lion, now reduced to a leaking cadaver whose decayed fluids fed a starving mongrel. Agnes Strickland, a 19th-century historian, would later quote from a Sloane manuscript recording the incident. In the morning, was suddenly seen a dog creeping and licking up the king's blood. For the horrified onlookers, this ghastly tableau fulfilled the friar's prophecy. The king's final undignified voyage had been literally paved with his own blood. Despite the legend, historians note a mundane explanation. The build-up of decomposition gases ruptured the heavy coffin. In 1813, when Windsor's royal vault was opened, officers reported that Henry's lead coffin had been burst by the gases evolved by the corpse, as one witness put it. In other words, the bloated king's body finally won a final explosive battle with its own tomb. Whether myth or chemistry, the image of dogs licking a king's gore became part of Henry's monstrous legacy. At last, Henry VIII's shattered remains were interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, laid to rest beside his third wife, Jane Seymour. But even as moss grew over his stone, the stories of his death endured in lurid detail. The burial may have been solemn, but the final chapter of his life plays out more like a grotesque Gothic tale, a king bedevilled by disease in life and by decay in death. In death, as in his notorious reign, Henry VIII remains one of history's most notorious figures. Monstrous, dramatic, and forever remembered for the bloody spectacle of his end.